Hey everyone, Andrea Walford here for Simon Says Stamp. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I created this Meowy Christmas card using some Simon Says Stamp exclusive products. So I'm working here on the front of an A2 sized card, which is 4¼ by 5½ inches, that I created out of a 4¼ by 11-inch piece of 120-pound weight Simon Says Stamp cardstock. Now I'm going to be employing a double masking technique where I'm going to be using the positive and negative masks of a circle to create my background. So I took a sheet of masking paper and a circle die that measured somewhere around 3 5/8 of an inch in diameter, and I die cut it towards the left-hand edge of my masking paper. I then positioned it over top of my card front and then made sure the entire front of the card was covered other than that circle. I then took a second die cut circle, which measured 1 inch in diameter, and placed it towards the top right of the circle, so to the inside of the larger circle mask that I had created. Now the first thing that I wanted to do was to create a sponge night sky background, and for that I used 3 different colors of my Tim Holtz Distress ink. Now the first color I started with was my lightest color, and that was my Tim Holtz Broken China Distress ink, and I applied it using the ink applicator tool. So I would pounce my ink applicator tool onto my ink pad, and then I would start on the masking paper working inwards onto the card front, working in a circular motion. And you may notice that when you first apply your ink, it applies in a looks kind of patchy and it's very light. So to get a nice depth of color, you have to come back and repeatedly apply layers of the Broken China Distress ink onto your card front. Now, the initial layers will look quite kind of blotchy, but as you start building up the color, it'll start to smooth out and even out. So I probably worked on that for a good 3 minutes, I would say, blending on the Broken China Distress ink until I got it to a depth that I was happy with. And then from there, I then moved on with my second ink color. So the second color I chose was the Seedless Preserves Distress ink, and this time I applied it with a mini ink blending tool, which is a smaller version of the larger ink applicator tool, and the sponge is actually shaped in a circle, and it just makes it a little bit easier to get into smaller areas, and you have a little bit more control and less likelihood of getting harsh edges with it. So I use that to apply my Seedless Preserves Distress ink, and I applied it towards the top of the circle, bringing it down probably just a little bit more than halfway. And I just kept adding it until I got it to a depth that I was happy with. So the last color that I applied was my Chipped Sapphire Distress ink, and I went back to using a regular ink applicator tool. I just pounced it on my ink pad, pounced off a little bit on my grid paper, and then just carefully brought it in, again working in a circular motion along the top edge of the circle and then down along the right hand edge of the circle as well. And I just applied it until I got a depth of color that I was happy with, because I really wanted to give the impression of night falling. So now before moving on, I took my heat tool to my card front just to make sure that my inked background was completely dry, because my next layer is going to be applying some embossing paste and then using some embossing powder over top of it, and I wanted to make sure that the embossing powder did not end up sticking to wet ink. So now the stencil that I'm using here is a Simon Says Stamp Falling Stars stencil. So I positioned it over my inked area and then grabbed some of my Wendy Vecchi Studio 490 embossing paste. Now I'm using a translucent embossing paste and applying it with a plastic palette knife. So I wanted to make sure that I had some of those stars inside the entire inked background area. Now I just applied it in a very thin layer, and then using the edge of my palette knife, I scraped off the excess and put it back into my jar. Now when you're working with embossing paste, you do want to make sure that you clean your palette knife and thoroughly clean your stencil immediately after you use it, because you really want to make sure that that embossing paste does not stick to either your stencil or your palette knife. So after cleaning off my stencil and palette knife and setting those aside, I then took a fine tip pair of tweezers to help me carefully remove the mask for my moon, and then I just removed the entire masking paper that I had placed over the front of my card. Now at this point, my embossing paste was still wet, and I wanted to make sure that I got my embossing glitter on there immediately so that it would stick to the wet embossing paste. Now I'm using here, it's from Wow Embossing Powder. It's a clear sparkle embossing glitter. So I sprinkled it directly over top of all my embossing paste stars, and then carefully tipped my card and tapped off the excess embossing glitter from the front of my card. Now there's probably a few areas where my ink might not have been still totally dry because I did have some issues with the embossing glitter sticking in areas other than my stars or in between my stars. So I just took a clear or a fine tip round brush and just use that to brush off the stray embossing glitter and to clean it up as much as I could before I took my Ranger heated craft tool to it and then heated the embossing glitter until it melted. And I then set my card aside to let the embossing paste keep drying while I moved on to the next step. So for the focal point image of my card, I decided to use this cat image from the Christmas Cats stamp set by Simon Says Stamp, and also the little Christmas hat. So I stamped them onto a scrap piece of my 120-pound Simon Says Stamp white cardstock using my Memento Tuxedo Black ink. So I decided to color in my image using Copic markers in different shades of gray. So I chose N1, N2, N3, N4, and N5. Now normally I never use that many markers when I'm coloring in an image. Typically I will stick to 3 different shades, a light, a mid, and a dark tone. Now I just find though that if you have the intermediary shades, it makes it a lot easier to achieve a nice smooth blend a lot faster. So if you have it, then by all means use the shades in between, so like I did in this case. So I started off the same way I do whenever I'm coloring with my Copic markers. You can color from light to dark or dark to light. My personal preference has always been to color from dark to light because I find that you use a lot less of the marker than you do if you work the other way around, because usually when you're working from light to dark, you'll start by coloring the entire area of your image in the light color, then you'll add shades with your dark color, then you'll come back and go over the entire area with your light color. So you end up really saturating your paper with your marker. So I just find that when you work from dark to light, you can see I'm only working on a small segment. I'll apply a small amount of the darkest color. I'll then blend that out using a little bit of the next shade, and then I'll take the next lighter shade and blend that out a little bit, and I keep moving downwards. So you want to make sure that when you're working with your markers, you're working with the brush tip of the marker and you're holding your marker on an angle and you're applying, it's called a flicking or a feathering stroke. Now, generally when I come back with my lighter color over the darker one that went before it, I don't go over the entire area of the darker stroke that I laid down. I'll just pull out the edge. And then once I've applied my first layer, I'll then go back with the second layer. Now, typically you'll notice that when you've applied your first layer of your markers that it is going to look quite patchy. But then as you go back and as you start going over it again with your second layer, you'll notice that it'll start to smooth out. Now, when I'm working with large images like this one, I also like to only work on half of an image at a time. As it is, this is a large enough image that it might not be a bad idea to break it down into 2. So you work on the top half and the bottom half and then blend them together. But in this case, I didn't really feel like doing it. I just did it along the entire left side of the cat. And then once I had blended out that side and I was happy with it, I then rotated my cardstock and started working on the other side of my cat. And the reason I rotated my cardstock was simply because I find it a lot easier when I'm doing that flicking or feathering motion to work from left to right. Now for the stomach of the cat, I decided to shade it in with some grays as well, except I used N0, N1, and N2 for that. And then finally, for the inside of the cat's ears, I just used a little bit of the N0. Now, to give the cat's nose a little bit of a pinkish hue, I just added a little bit of R22. And then I also added a little bit of that R22 into the corners of the ears, and then just blended that out using a little bit of the N0. So now I colored my Santa hat using the exact same technique that I used for my cat image, except I used this time only 3 different shades of colors, a light, medium, and a dark. And for my light, I used R22. For my medium shade, I used R24. And then for the dark shade, I used R27. Now once I had finished coloring both my images, I then took a fine tip pair of scissors and I just fussy cut both of the images out. And as I cut, I just tried to stay as close to the line as I could without actually going over the line. Now after I'd finished cutting my images, I then took my Wink of Stella clear glitter pen and then just used that and brushed it all over the cat's belly and on the inside of the cat's ears as well, and then set that aside to dry while I worked on my sentiment. So the sentiment is Meowy Christmas, and it's from the same stamp set, the Christmas Cats from Simon Says Stamp. Now I stamped it onto a 1-inch strip of Simon Says Stamp 120-pound white cardstock using my Memento Tuxedo Black ink. So now in order to determine what size I wanted my sentiment flag to be, I placed it onto my card front and really just eyeballed it. So I took a look at where I thought I wanted it to be, then I grabbed my scissors and I cut a triangular shaped notch out of the right hand edge, and that creates kind of a fishtail is what it's called. And then for the left hand edge, I simply took a pencil, made a little mark where I needed to cut it, and then took it to my paper trimmer and trimmed it down. Now I decided I wanted a little bit of dimension, so to stick my flag down, I used some dimensional foam, and I used dimensional foam that's 1/16 of an inch thick. I just applied a few pieces to the back of my sentiment flag, and then I aligned the left edge of my sentiment flag with the left edge of my card. Now one quick note I do want to mention is that I did take my card to my paper trimmer and I cut off just a sliver off of the left hand edge, because when we were doing the inking, as the sponge was coming onto the cardstock from the left hand edge, as it would catch on the edge, I ended up with this darker line that I really didn't like. So I just trimmed that off using my paper trimmer. Now after my sentiment flag was stuck down, I decided that I was also going to pop up my cat, so I applied a little bit more dimensional foam to the back of that. And then for the hat, I just glued that on using some of my Tombow Mono multi-liquid glue. So I just applied a small amount under to the back of the hat brim and then very carefully stuck that down to my cat. And then my very last step was to add just a little bit more bling by applying 3 large clear rhinestones, one above the other, to the left side of my sentiment flag. And that's how I created my card. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial, and I look forward to creating with you again.